You live by that.
That's what he used to do.
It's everything, man.
Yes.
Well, that was a welcome, all right. At Rocky Sullivan's as always, and we're here the second Wednesday of every month. And tonight we have a very great privilege. We have Pete Hamill with us, the author most recently, North River. And it doesn't look like you have any books here, Pete. But you can pick it up in paper at your nearest bookstore. And Pete has agreed to talk about Brooklyn, where he lived and grown up. And welcome, Pete Hamill.
Thanks, Sandy. I thought that was an electrocution. When I was asked to talk about Brooklyn, I said, how many days do you have? Because I'm a son of Brooklyn. I'll be buried in Brooklyn. I've lived a lot of my life here. And it's been a place of many gifts. The first gifts that I received came in the form of both my mother and my father. They were immigrants from Belfast in Northern Ireland. My father arrived in 1924. My mother arrived on October 24th, 1929, with perfect Irish timing, the day the stock market crashed. So the gift that came with that was a complicated one. My father was not much of a talker. He came from a culture of Catholic males in Belfast in which words could get you killed. Seamus Heaney has a great poem about the style. It's called The Style of the Males of Belfast and other cities in the north. It's called Whatever You Say, Say Nothing. And so he expressed himself in a different way. He expressed himself with his enthusiasms that came in an elliptical way, mostly about baseball by the time I was a kid. And he expressed himself with song. And I think the songs were the most permanent part of Ireland that he took with him to the United States. He was not much for the kind of Tin Pan Alley version of Irish music, but he wasn't glum either. He sang songs ranging from the Green Glens of Antrim to Paddy McGinty's Goat. He loved entertaining. It was a period well before television, well before the radio, in which people provided their own entertainment. And when I was able finally to see him in a bar, I could see a different person from the one that was sitting in the kitchen. He was an entertainer. He loved singing, dancing, even though he had one leg and couldn't dance. He lost his leg playing football or soccer in 1927. Kicked in a game out in Brooklyn, right across from Greenwood Cemetery. There was a field there called Wanderers Oval. He was kicked, taken to Kings County Hospital years before penicillin. Woke up with gangrene and had his left leg amputated. His part of the Irish saga came in the aftermath. Some people threw what they called then a beer racket to raise money for him. While everybody was singing and dancing and laughing and so on, the guy that ran the racket took off with the money. 6 weeks later, they had another racket, singing, dancing, laughter. The guy that ran that one took off with the money. I keep thinking that's the way New Jersey was populated. By people who stole money from beer rackets for guys who had lost legs or arms or hands, and not in the wars. They met. After my mother arrived, she went to work as a domestic for a very nice family that stayed in touch with her and us for the rest of their lives. One of the great gifts that came from that family around 1944, 45 was the collected works of Mark Twain, the whole set. And so my brother Tommy and my sister and I read our way through Mark Twain, not simply Tom Sawyer, who we thought was a bit of a stiff, Huckleberry Finn, who was more like people in the neighborhood, but reading Life on the Mississippi, Roughing It, the Connecticut Yankee, all the amazing things that Twain was capable of. And we read our way through them because at the time, after the war, it was still before television. There was still the act of reading to give you companionship and information and a vision of the future. All of that lay ahead. My father worked in a place that you can walk to from here. It's a long walk, but you can walk to it on 9th Street, just above the Gowanus Canal, because a good Tammany guy helped him get the job, because he had good handwriting. He was a left-handed guy who was forced by the nuns to write with his right hand. And so the penmanship was terrific. Some of the grammar was very original. He would say, in letters to me later in the Navy and other places, he would say, we went, quote, to the ballpark, unquote. I would wonder, what the hell does that mean? Did he go to the bar instead of what was the meaning of the quotes? But he wasn't being sarcastic. He just didn't, he just didn't have the education. He went to the 8th grade, period. That was it. But my mother was a reader, and so books were there from the beginning, and so was the library. The nearest library to us is still there. It's on 9th Street and 6th Avenue. It was then called the Prospect branch of the Brooklyn Public Library, and it's now the Park Slope branch. It was built wholly by my favorite American millionaire, Andrew Carnegie. I never heard of Andrew Carnegie when I was a kid, but he built 1,600 libraries. And I always say, imagine Donald Trump going into a library. He built them in New York, he built them around the country, he built them in Scotland, where he came as an immigrant, as a kid to Pittsburgh. When he went to Pittsburgh, and when he was 11 years old, there was only one library, and it was private. He went to that library to try to look at books and find some way into the future, and was turned away because he had a Scots accent, and he was wearing fairly ragged clothes by his account. And so in his mind he said, I will be back. And so he did come back and made libraries that kids today who never heard of him are using to this very moment. Growing up there, and I didn't know it at the time, I received some great gifts. The most important gift of all was poverty in some odd way. Because I learned later in life that there are worse things than being poor. And I was part of the last generation of white New Yorkers who grew up poor. mostly children of immigrants, Italian immigrants, Irish immigrants, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. And the Depression, which is much on everybody's minds these days, was part of the reason that we learned something from being poor. That was a great gift that lasted a lot of us, my age. I'm older than McCain, for God's sakes. It lasted us a lifetime. The fact was that without money, other things took greater precedence. Decency, good manners, a sense that we can help each other even in bad times, and that we could do something to make sure we'll get through this without doing too many things that we'd be thoroughly ashamed of later. I think that gift is the thing that ended up being rewarded and it turned into something incredibly important with the best government program I ever heard of, the GI Bill of Rights. It was there for those guys who didn't profit from the war but fought it. And it was there when they came back. In my neighborhood, most of them took the housing benefits rather than the educational benefits. But the ones that came a little bit later took the education benefits. They were among 8 million Americans who took the educational benefits on the GI Bill, which was not a government handout, but a government reward for service and a government investment in the future. And it made modern America possible because it meant that the son of a Jewish cab driver, the son of an Irish factory worker, the son of an Italian construction worker, all of them could go to the university too. And that's what happened. They went and never looked back. So those of us who are here tonight, I'm sure all of us know somebody whose life was changed by the GI Bill, by the sense of possibility and hope that it offered us. And as we enter hard times, if we could take the deeper lessons from that generation, the one that Tom Brokaw calls the greatest generation, we can get through anything that'll happen. It doesn't mean that life will be perfect or that a utopia has ever been possible, but people can treat each other with amazing decency and care. There was nobody in that neighborhood, and I grew up on 7th Avenue between 11th and 12th Street. My father worked in the factory across the way, now a condominium, of course. There was nobody in that neighborhood, no old lady in an apartment who had to worry about how to get the groceries up the stairs. Somebody was there. Somebody would help. There was nobody who would die alone. The neighbors came and checked and made sure the person ate. There was nobody who thought that the world was reduced to a dot and there was nobody on the other side of the dot. That never happened. I got to know a lot of them delivering newspapers. It was my first newspaper job, I always say. I delivered the Brooklyn Eagle as a subcontractor to a guy named Dan O'Kelly on 4th and 5th Street between 7th Avenue and the Park, which is why one shoulder is lower than the other for the rest of my life. But even then, in a neighborhood that was better than the one we were in, you got to know these amazingly decent people who asked about your family and wanted to know how your mother was because they knew her from somewhere, either church or some of the jobs she held. She had one great, wonderful job that all my brothers, and I was the oldest of 7, one sister, she had the only room with a door. We had this one great additional gift, which was that my mother became the cashier at the RKO Prospect on 9th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue. A few doors away was the Cube Steak, a restaurant where some people that you might call hoodlums, basically because they were, hung out, but would never think about hurting an old woman or a kid or somebody defenseless. They never did. They had a code too. And as the cashier, we had a great right. We could slip in for free. She would tell the guy at the door, my son, my 2 sons. And some movies were so awful that we didn't want to go to them. You know, they were, I remember seeing like 20 minutes of Mario Lanza in some movie about, I think it was The Great Caruso.
Great Caruso.
Yeah, and I said, I gotta get out of here. I gotta. Maybe I can run to Red Hook. But the place itself was wonderful because it had a balcony, it had vaudeville on Tuesday nights, and it had some interesting characters that came in and out. My mother was on the box office one night when a guy came to the usher at the door and said, I gotta page somebody, because they had a paging system so that if a doctor was at the movies and some patient was dying at the Methodist hospital, they could come in and page him, walk down, call his name. No cell phones then, thank God. So this one night the guy came in and he went in and the usher said, follow me, sir. And he went down, the usher kept saying, paging Willie Pagano. Down the right lane, the right aisle, paging Willie Pagano. Nothing. Paging Willie Pagano. He goes up the other side, the front in front of the screen, up the other side, paging Willie Pagano. He gets about halfway up and the guy says, I'm Willie Pagano. At which point the other guy took a gun and shot him dead. The RKO chain discontinued the paging services the following day. But I thought for years, maybe this is an urban legend, but years later when I was working at the Daily News, I looked up the clips and found out that it was true. That some poor dope named Willie Pagano who didn't pay somebody something, or stole something from somebody, or treated a woman badly that he never should have treated badly, and was shot to death at the RKO Prospect. And I looked in the days afterwards and there was still nothing. They never arrested him. There were only 1,200 witnesses at the RKO Prospect. The times being the times, and nothing was said. So we had the movies. Because there was no television, books became fundamental. I spent a whole summer, I think I was 13, reading The Count of Monte Cristo. I went back and renewed it twice. So you could have the book for 28 days, and if you kept it beyond that, you paid 2 cents a day. And I brought the book, and I read this book, and I said, oh man, whatever I do, I don't want to go to that Chateau d'If. And reading it through, the longest novel I had ever read at the time, maybe since. And years later, I went to visit the boxer Mike Tyson in jail in Indianapolis to write an article about him, because my brothers knew him, he knew me less well. And I went to talk to him, and I said, what are you doing here? He says, I'm doing a lot of reading. He had that sort of thin, lispy voice. I said, what? What are you reading? He says, I love this Count of Monte Cristo. I really identify with him. Unjustly accused, stuck in a Chateau d'If. So here I am with Mike Tyson from Amboy Street, Brownsville, sitting in the visiting room in this prison, and and we start talking about, you know, Edmond Dantes and what had been done to him in the pages by Victor Hugo. And Tyson told me then that he had never read a novel before. He's a very intelligent guy who has done some dumb things, not, you know, exclusive to him. But I realized again the power of language and books and words and so when I went to the library, I was staying in Brooklyn for a couple of months last year. I went to the library where I had borrowed the book of the Count of Monte Cristo, and I went upstairs to where they have the sort of classics, and there was no copy of it. So I walked down 7th Avenue to Barnes & Noble, bought the best copy I could get with the largest type, and brought it back and said, I want to donate this book to the library. Can I do that here? The woman said, sure. I came back about a month later. It wasn't there. And what I'm hoping is that some kid is on his 3rd renewal reading about Edmond Dantes and having a sense of what the future might be. Because I think that's what libraries in particular can do, even in hard times. I saw a thing on the news the other night that library attendance is up during this recession 40% in some places. 40%. Any politician who even mutters that he's thinking of closing libraries should be told to go live in a homeless shelter for a couple of weeks. That would take away what we have that's unviable, that you can't get any other way, and you can't get through the passive instrument of television. Television, you sit and you click, and you can do mood altering of all kinds of ways, from sports events to erotica to whatever you want to feast on. You don't have to do any work. Reading, you have to take these little abstractions called words, these little codes, and make pictures out of them. And I think that is the thing that makes my generation different from some of the ones that followed. That we're still people who need to create these pictures ourselves without having it all done for us, and us sitting only as an audience before those pictures. The Brooklyn that I went and visited last year, the part of my Brooklyn, it was fascinating because it was a part where there was not a lot of physical damage. It was not Brownsville or East New York. The buildings had not burned down. The buildings were still there. The people were all different, partly as a result of age, partly as a result of the way the economy of New York changed. Most of them, when I was growing up, like most of the people living in Red Hook or near it, derived their money and their energy and their companionship and the sense of being a comrade with other people in a common purpose from the waterfront. But the waterfront began dying in the late 50s, early 60s. The piers along the Hudson all moved to New Jersey. Coming over on the N train over the Manhattan Bridge, you can look down and see the East River empty, except for little cruise boats and ferries. Nothing, no commercial cargo whatsoever. Which means that the economy changed and people followed the jobs that did remain to New Jersey. If you were a longshoreman 50 years old, you went to New Jersey to try to get another 10 years out of your membership in the union. So they were not driven out, contrary to some myths. Yuppies didn't come and drive them out. It didn't happen that way. It was first they left, then came the young. And standing around on 7th Avenue, watching people go by, seeing the factory where my father worked, Um, Now housing people who make more in a week than he made in a year. I'm struck by how young most of them were, and then I realized that when I was living there, my mother and father were young. My mother, I'm the oldest of the 7 kids, so I'm the last one who remembers her with brown hair because she was young. And it was the kind of place people went to for a while. They didn't say, I have the top floor right at 378 7th Avenue and I want to live there until you carry me out. That didn't happen very often. People owned houses. There was a different sense of permanence, but most of the apartments were different. So wandering around and seeing young people, I felt exhilarated. No matter what they do for a living, no matter how nervous they are sometimes, they won't look you in the eye, they go walking along like this, you know. And then the ones that have the cell phone thing, gadgets under the chin, the first time I saw them, I said, geez, a lot of people talking to themselves, you know, and you only catch snatches of it, you know. I told them 12,000 or nothing, you know. You say, I wonder what that was. It wasn't about buying pretzels. Most of them are after the same thing that the generation of my parents were after, which is if they get married and have kids, they want the kids to have a better shot than they did. Although they're not coming from poverty, they're coming from the middle class mainly. Some of them might be rich. You see apartments with 4 NYU kids in them, and I asked one old real estate guy there named John Byrne, I said, what's the difference now between 50 years ago? He said, in my day we were used to barracks, they're used to dorms. And I think it was that distinction that's going on in that part of what the real estate guys have renamed the South Slope. But I don't look down on it. I remember when it was going bad and the junkies were everywhere, and I still think gentrification's better than junkies. I think there has to be some place for people to live who are immigrants or who come from other parts of the United States wanting to be dancers or actors or writers or something. There has to be a way to house those people. It's the lifeblood that keeps renewing the city of New York. It might not be there. It might be Williamsburg now. Maybe Williamsburg has gotten too hot and it's going to be Midwood. Who knows? But I don't get upset by what I see. I look at it and I know the world has changed. I know the Dodgers don't play in Brooklyn anymore. I know that you can't go back and you can't sentimentalize it too much. But the thing that I have been thinking about the last few months as the economy has gone by is how important it will be for my generation of New Yorkers to help those who never knew what it was like to be poor. That we can help them. We can show them how to do some things and how to have lives that are equally as dense as anything that goes along with the rituals of modern young life in this city. There's signs of hope everywhere. I noticed in the shoe store in my neighborhood, people are actually showing up to get soles and heels on their shoes instead of throwing them away or at the president. That's a cheap shot. God, I love that guy. Most of all, we could try to pass on the notion that there are some things that are more important than money. In this latest breakdown, we've had 3 suicides so far, one in Germany, one in the Midwest, and one other. If they committed suicide because they lost their money, then they were living the wrong life. If all you do is live your life for the amount of money you can accumulate or the number of houses you can have or boats or cars or whatever. It's the wrong life. My biggest objection to hip-hop videos is the life that they're showing people and presenting it as if it's desirable to sit at a pool with 6 women in bikinis running around, drinking various drinks that need straws. That's not what life is about. That's not what you should be looking for. And I think Brooklyn, at its best, has the chance to be one of those processing plants for people to understand what the possibility of the future is while drawing on the lessons of the past. So in some of my work I do that, other writers are doing it too. I think we end up failing a lot of times because it's not always easy to recreate a time and place. But I think it's happening. The other day I went to see the movie Slumdog Millionaire, which just won the Golden Globes. And it reminded me in certain ways of Brooklyn. Nobody in it looked like anyone in the neighborhood I grew up in. But the desires, the hopes, the belief in the possibility of a future, sometimes that future is represented and symbolized by one woman. If you're a young boy, if you can't find that woman, you will have failed at life. I think all of us have things in common that we imagine the future before we live it. I imagined Jackie Robinson before I saw him play in the summer of 1947. I imagined him from the radio and from the Daily News at the Brooklyn Eagle. You imagine what's out there and have notions of it. And I think men and women share in that common thing of being the creatures on this earth who imagine, and who imagine the future, and say, gee, wouldn't it be great if you could do this, that, or the other thing? And I think everything we can do to keep that kind of vivid, lovely, unvengeful imagination alive is going to put a city here in 30 or 40 or 50 years that I just wish I could live long enough to see. Somebody told me about a street out in the middle of Brooklyn. One side of the street is Chinese, and the other side of the street is Pakistani. And all I could think of is, what food is going to come out of it? You know, we're going to have dim sum curry or something, whatever it is, but something that comes out, which is the whole story of New York, the way people who are not like you keep showing up and merging eventually. The music is usually the first thing, the history of the Latinos in this town. We heard their music before some of us even knew their names. We heard it in cars, we heard it from the 3rd floor left on a Saturday morning. Then the food. Now, I have to say, Irish food never made much of an impact.
That's not true.
The reason is complicated. But I was reading a history of Paris a couple of years ago, and it reminded me what I sort of knew, that Paris was founded by Celts, a tribe called the Parisi, which is where the Paris came from. And they saw the Ile de la Cité and said, who needs anything else? It's got a river on both sides. You know, let's stay here. So they didn't keep going to Ireland or Scotland or Wales or anywhere else. They just sat there. So I called my friend Clyde Haverman at the Times. I said, Clyde, I now know why I love Paris. It was founded by the Celts. There's a pause on the other line. He said, if that's true, why is the food so good? So all I could think of right away was, because they had the great good fortune to be conquered by the Romans and not the Brits. Because that's the curse of Irish history, the enduring curse until recent years. It was the culinary heritage of the British, who thought food was fuel, that pleasure could not possibly be allowed to come from consuming this stuff. You got to put the coal down your chute and then go out and whip the help. So the immigration wave adds to the New York identity. Because after food comes language. My favorite example of the way languages come together in New York City was a headline in El Diario about 3 or 4 years ago in Spanish, and it said, Serrano dice, Serrano says, yo no soy un schmuck. That's the New York headline. Because the assumption was that every Spanish-speaking reader of El Diario knew what a schmuck was. And I'm sure even they were saying it when Elliot Spitzer got caught. But out of that comes something stronger than anybody would be in isolation. You know, my neighborhood, I was blessed again because it was Irish, Italian, and Jewish. The Jews made up a smaller percentage, and most were small shopkeepers. You know, they would own a variety store, candy stores, a lot of candy stores. They got along pretty well with everybody, but they were not as overwhelming in numbers as the Irish and the Italians. And the Irish and Italians were up against each other's noses for a long time, until they started marrying each other. There were some unruly weddings, I guess. But the thing they got out of it were amazingly complicated. And wonderful. I always say that part of the history of my family, a turning point in the family, was when Mrs. Caputo came across the hall and finally taught my mother how to make the sauce. You know, she went through it step by step, as if you were talking to a 2-year-old. Then you add the basil, you know, and we started to eat it. My brother John is here. I think he was a tot when all this happened, but we didn't want anything else for the rest of our lives. We would have settled for pasta for breakfast, pasta for lunch, and pasta at night, with a little pizza thrown in between from Dirty John's on 3rd Street. Then you found that alloy, the mixture of the people, created a sense of strength that was beyond belief. In that neighborhood, if somebody mugged an old lady, just as I mentioned about the cube steak, the bad guys would track down the guy who did it and throw him off a roof or something. The sense that the toughness which had gotten them through both the Depression and the war, because when the war ended, it was the end of a 15-year-old period of austerity where nobody had enough. You always seemed to end the week about 60 cents short. That toughness is what allowed them to live full, rich lives later on. I don't mean rich in the sense of money in the bank. I mean in the sense of understanding what's important, what's fundamental to living a life. And I think those lessons, those attitudes that we picked up on the streets, not with preachers, not somebody saying, you must do this. We had priests in church and so on, but mostly people in church were going like this, looking at the girl in the fourth row and the other. You know, they weren't exactly all consumed with visions of heaven or redemption. The guys my age, what we wanted was sin. You know, redemption could come later. But I think the toughness is the great, in the true toughness. I don't mean loudmouth toughness. I mean a toughness that's about the ability to endure, to get through hard times without self-pity, which was the unforgivable sin after violence. For people to publicly say that, feel sorry for themselves, was never forgiven. You couldn't console them because they had faltered. It was when they had trouble and refused to admit it until you went to them and said, can we help, that something could come out of it. There were many other things from Brooklyn, and I could go on for weeks, but the great lesson, one of them came from the Dodgers. It's no accident that the prevailing slogan in Brooklyn for 10 years was, wait till next year. And then finally in 1955, next year came and the Dodgers beat the goddamn Yankees and made it all seem true, that you just patient and keep coming back and coming back and coming back, and you'll win. The Dodgers were there. The changes that came with the GI Bill were crucial to the neighborhood. When I went into the Navy as a kid, I didn't know anybody who'd ever gone to the university. When I came back, 4 people in the neighborhood were going, and one of them was my brother Tom. It was an amazing thing, but also among the blue-collar guys themselves. I worked for a year at the Brooklyn Navy Yard as an apprentice shipyard sheet metal worker. It was really thought of as a great job because it was federal civil service. You'd never lose it. But when I was there, the guys I worked with, welders, and people who cut tin, they called them tin knockers in Shop 17. The ones that even noticed that I was there, 3 or 4 of them came and said, what are you doing here? And I'd say, well, I dropped out of high school. Get into the services and get the GI Bill and don't ever come back here. One of them, a guy named Eddie McManus, came in one day. He's one of the few guys I knew who had seen my father play soccer in the 1920s and knew him. And he had a book for me, and he gave me the book. He said, read this. And it was a book called Martin Eden by Jack London. And there was also a story about a kid who wanted to do something else. And it was very difficult and impossible, maybe. But I began to hear some of the discussions of Joe Sixpack and all that last year and saying, that's not what I remember about blue-collar people. They weren't sitting around getting loaded each night. None of them went bowling. They were too tired at the end of a day's work. And they also had aspirations which they could not have attained because of the Depression, to go for their kids and for the young in general to go and do something. So that's what I took out of the blue-collar world that I lived in there. I took exactly what my mother and father took out of the same experience, where they only wanted a job. They didn't, something like a career was beyond their ability to imagine. Careers were going to be for their kids. They hoped their kids would be taller, smart, better educated, and decent. That's what they wanted. It wasn't like wanting to own 9 yachts. It was something else, something more fundamental. And what's extraordinary to me when I meet people my age now wandering around, particularly the New Yorkers, is how common that experience was. It was not just my neighborhood or Brooklyn itself, but it was on the west side of Manhattan. It was the Bronx. It was parts of Queens. Queens was still farmland when I was a kid. They actually grew things in Queens. But most of them had that sense that you're in America, you can be more than you could have been if you'd stayed home. I always think about one particular case, and then I'll wind up, we'll talk a little bit. In 1840, Charles Dickens came to New York. He was then in his 30s. He was in the first period of his great fame, because he was a great writer, one of the greatest. And somebody took him to the 5 Points in Lower Manhattan, around where Foley Square and Chinatown are now. And I always loved Foley Square because it's not named after a hero of any war or a cop or anything. It's named after a Tammany boss who gave Al Smith his first job, therefore ensuring his immortality. But they took Dickens to this one place in the 5 Points. It was a club, a black and tan club as they called them then, where both blacks and whites were present. And he sees a dancer, a black kid, a freed slave from Rhode Island, who's about 16, 17. And he sees him and he's astonished. And he writes a piece about how he has just seen the greatest dancer there ever was. And when Charles Dickens, with all the authority of his accomplishments, had said such a thing, the guys from the Bowery theaters said, we can make some money on this. And they hooked him up with an Irish kid named John Diamond, and began to have what later, 100 years later in the bebop era, were called cutting contests. The guy would play 16 bars on a saxophone, the trumpet player would say, yeah, you think that's good, watch this. They started competing with each other in the big theaters on the Bowery and later on even in London. And together they invented tap dancing. It didn't exist before because the Irish kid was a clog dancer like you would see at Riverdance or one of those shows. The African American kid was doing some new thing that was based on the music before it was built on tradition. And together they forged bits and pieces of each other and invented one of the enduring American popular arts that's still here all these years later. Everything came from those two kids. Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly, and the Nicholas brothers, and Gregory Hines, and all kinds of people all came from that. And that's why the city like New York is infinitely more exciting culturally and otherwise than many other places. If that black kid had stayed with his family and been born in Africa, they wouldn't have invented tap dancing. If the Irish kid had stayed in Ireland, the same thing. Coming here and merging with each other in the creation of a new popular art was the thing that made them go. The black kid, unfortunately, died in London from food poisoning, of course. Talk about never having a chance. So And he died pretty young, like 23 or something. But the form that they invented is with us still. So anything we can do now, any of us, whether we had an Irish, Jewish, Italian, whatever the background was, or African Americans who've been here longer than the immigrants, when we see these new immigrants, if you go to Sunset Park on Fifth Avenue and see those Mexican women working, they're us. It's my mother. If you see those Mexican workers and, washing dishes and working as short order cooks and so on, they're us. And we should lift them, give them a hand to just say, anything you need, what are you going to do? How are your kids? Thanks for coming. We should do that because we're part of that. The one final thing I want to mention is, again, my mother, who was so crucial to us because she was articulate. She could say the things my father couldn't say. I remember going with her. We loved, when I was a kid, during the war, to go to the West Side docks to see the Normandy, which was a French luxury liner which burned at the pier in 1942. And we loved going over there to see it, because as kids we could get close enough. They wouldn't let everybody as close as we got, because we were small. I was maybe 8. My brother was 6. And every time we went there, there was less of it, because they were cutting it up and sawing it up and using it to turn it to tanks or whatever for the war. And we were walking over there, or it must have been 43rd Street, having taken the subway from Brooklyn to Times Square and walking across and getting to about 10th Avenue. And there was what we today would call a homeless guy sitting there with a cup, not the cardboard cups that we have now, but a cup, just begging. And Tommy and I started making wisecracks, apprentice Brooklyn wise guys. And my mother lost it and said to us, "Don't you ever look down on anyone unless you're giving them a hand to get up." And that stayed with me the rest of my life. When I was a newspaper man, I tried to use whatever small powers I might have to help some. The first byline I ever got in the New York Post in 1960 was about a guy who had been evicted from a house in Brooklyn with his 3 kids and his wife for not paying the rent, and he'd lost a job. He was sitting in the rain on top of a bureau when I got there, and I wrote about him, put it in the paper, and the readers began to call in with jobs, with apartments, with anything they could do to help this man pick up his life. And I think of him a lot now when foreclosures are going on everywhere. People who gullibly or otherwise, because there were 2 paychecks in the family, bought a house they probably shouldn't have bought. And one job gets lost and they can't make the payments. Those are people we should be giving a hand to get up. They're not what's wrong with the world. So there were lessons from Brooklyn that I carry to my grave, which will be, by the way, in Brooklyn, as I mentioned earlier. A couple of years ago, my wife's father died without leaving a will. And so, this was in Tokyo. My wife is Japanese. And when she came home, she said, "We have to get a plot." I said, "You mean to put yo?" She said, "Yes." So the next day I called up Greenwood Cemetery and I talked to the guy. I said, "Is there anything left?" The last time I looked, there were 540,000 graves in Greenwood Cemetery. He says, "Yeah, we got a few things here." I said, "Do you have anything near Boss Tweed?" And he says, "Hold on a minute." 30 seconds later, he comes back and says, "As a matter of fact, yes." We went out the next day, looked at this plot where the greatest felon in New York political history was buried with various members of the family all behind a little chain and everything, and right behind him over there wasn't the plot. We looked at each other and I said, we'll take it. And I keep thinking, if the Tammany guy hadn't given my father the job for $19 a week on 9th Street by the Gowanus, if the Democratic Party hadn't helped so many people become citizens and find work and get out of jail and bury their dead, where would we be? So I wanted to have if I had to get buried anywhere, I wanted at least if some of my friends go out to pay a visit, they'll at least have a good laugh. Because I'm sure the boss will take care of things if anything goes wrong. There's a lot of other distinguished people buried there, but the boss was extra special. So when you pass Greenwood Cemetery, tip your hat to the boss's memory and think about what he did for Brooklyn, because it was substantial. With that, I'll take any questions anybody has. I can't see very well.
I'll get out like that.
Questions, come on, somebody must have a question. For the love of God.
How do you feel about the Israeli invasion of Palestine? Understood.
Oh dear.
Well, I think on one level it's very dumb, because I saw what happened in Northern Ireland as a reporter, and in Lebanon, which I covered for a while. And there's always consequences when you overdo it. When the British would take someone, lift them, somebody not a member of the IRA, take him away, intern him for a couple of years in Longkesh. When he comes out, he's going to be a member of the IRA. If somebody goes in and manhandles somebody's mother, and the kid is 14, when the kid is 16, he's going to look to pay back. It's not the way to bring something to an end. It only prolongs it and adds another level. I'm not for firing rockets into Israel. I think it's equally dumb. But to have a massive, overwhelming response with airplanes and tanks and all that seems to be just seeding the future with more terrorists. I think that happened in Iraq too. You know, for a while it was the Paris Island of terrorism. You'd go there and train for a while and then head to Afghanistan, learning how to do IEDs and roadside bombs and all kinds of things. In the end, I think it has to be settled. There has to be a Palestinian state. Then I hope it gets settled soon, because too many Jews have died and too many Palestinians have died for it to go on and on and on forever. Yes?
Two questions. Did you have any memories of Red Hook as a kid? And the second question, any truth to the rumor that you're going to be the next senator from New York?
Oh, gee, they'd have to put me in handcuffs to deliver me to the Senate if that ever happened. The first memories of Red Hook had to do with the pool right after the war. Because when the Red Hook houses were built, my mother wanted very badly to get into them. Because where we lived, we had no steam heat. We had, it was a coal stove in the kitchen. And the family was a little crowded. And I know she applied for the Red Hook houses. And we came down one day while she was doing some kind of paperwork and went to the pool, Tommy and I. My sister was too young. And I thought it was paradise. Later, it got very bad and is now so much better, it's hard to express. But the projects which were so desired right after the war that would give shelter to people who couldn't afford it was a desirable thing then. She was rejected for whatever reason.